Olá, seja bem-vindo ao Audiobook da Morgan. A leitura de hoje é o capítulo 4 do livro Utz. Antes de começarmos essa leitura, eu vou pedir para você se inscrever no meu canal e ativar o sininho das notificações.
Utz was the owner of a spectacular collection of Meissen porcelain, which, through his adroit manoeuvres, had survived the Second World War and the years of Stalinism in Czechoslovakia. By 1967, it numbered over 1,000 pieces, all crammed into the tiny two-room flat on Sirolka Street. The Utzes of Krondorf had been a family of minor Saxon landowners with farms in the Sudetenland, prosperous enough to maintain a townhouse in Dresden, insufficiently grand to figure on the almanac Die Gotha. Among their ancestors they could point to a Crusader knight, but better-born Saxons would pronounce the name with an air of bewilderment, even of disgust. Utz? Utz? No, it is impossible. Who's this people? There were reasons for their scorn. In Grimm's etymological word book, Utz carries any number of negative connotations. Drunk, dimwit, card sharp, dealer in dead horses. Heisen, Kunzen, Utzen oder Butzen, in the dialect of Lower Swabia, is the equivalent of any old Tom, Dick and Harry. Utz's father was killed on the Somme in 1916, not before he had redeemed the family name by winning Germany's highest military decoration, pour le mérite. His widow, whom he had met at Marienbad in 1905 and had married to the anguish of his parents, was the daughter of a Czech revivalist historian and a Jewish heiress whose fortune came from railway shares. Kaspar was her only grandchild. As a boy, he spent a month of each summer at Český Krzyžov, a neo-medieval castle between Prague and Tabor, where this wasted old woman, whose sallow skin refused to wrinkle or hair turned to grey, sat crippled with arthritis in a saloon hung with crimson brocade and over-varnished paintings of the Virgin. A convert to Catholicism, she surrounded herself with unctuous and genuflecting priests who would extol the purity of her faith in the hope of financial rewards. The banks of begonias and cineronias in a conservatory protected her from a magnificent sweep of the central Bohemian countryside. Various neighbours were affronted that a woman of her race should affect the outward forms of aristocratic life to the extent of peopling her staircase with suits of armour and of keeping a bear in a walled-off section of the moat. Yet even before Sarajevo, she had foreseen the rising tide of socialism in Europe, and, twirling the terrestrial globe as another woman might recite the rosary, she would point a finger to the far-flung places in which she had diversified her investments. A copper mine in Chile, cotton in Egypt, a cannery in Australia, gold in South Africa. She rejoiced in the thought that her fortune would go on increasing after her death. Theirs would vanish. In war or revolution, on horses, women, and the gaming tables. In Kaspar, a dark-haired, introspective boy with none of his father's high complexion, she recognized the pallor of the ghetto and adored him. It was at Český Krzyžov that this precocious child, standing on tiptoe before a vitrine of antique porcelain, found himself bewitched by a figurine of Harlequin that had been modelled by the greatest of Meissen modellers, J. Gandler. The Harlequin sat on a tree trunk. His taut frame was sheathed in a costume of multicoloured chevrons. In one hand he waved an oxidized silver tankard, in the other a floppy yellow hat. Over his face there was a leering orange mask. "I want him," said Kaspar. The grandmother blanched. Her impulse was to give him everything he asked for, but this time she said no. One day perhaps, but not now. 4 years later, to console him for the death of his father, the Harlequin arrived in Dresden in a specially made leather box in time for a dismal Christmas celebration. Kaspar pivoted the figurine in the flickering candlelight and ran his pudgy fingers lovingly over the glaze and brilliant enamels. He had found his vocation. He will devote his life to collecting, rescuing, as he came to call it, the porcelains of the Meissen factory. He neglected his schoolroom studies, yet studied the history of porcelain manufacture from its origins in China to its rediscovery in Saxony and the region of Augustus the Strong. He bought new pieces. He sold off those which were inferior or cracked. By the age of 19, he had published in the journal Nunc a lively defense of the Rococo style in porcelain, an art of playful curves from an age when men adored women. Porcelain is almost always made into idiotic puppets. Utz spent hours in the museums of Dresden, scrutinizing the ranks of Commedia dell'arte arch figures that had come from the royal collections. Locked behind glass, they seemed to beckon him into their secret Lilliputian world, and also to cry for their release. His second publication was entitled The Private Collector. An object in a museum case, he wrote, must suffer the denatured existence of an animal in the zoo. In any museum the object dies of suffocation and the public gaze, whereas private ownership confers on the owner the right and the need to touch. As a young child will reach out to handle the thing it names, so the passionate collector, his eye in harmony with his hand, restores to the object the life-giving touch in its maker. The collector's enemy is the museum curator. Ideally, museums should be looted every 50 years and their collections returned to circulation. What, Utz's mother asked the family physician, is this mania of Kaspar's for porcelain? A perversion, he answered, same as any other. The sexual career of Augustus the Strong, as recounted by Yvonne Poulnitz in La Saxon Galant, served Utz as an exemplary model. But when, in a Viennese establishment, he aspired to imitate the conquest of that grandiose and insatiable monarch, hoping to discover in Mitzi, Susie, Elizal the charms of Aurora, Countess of Konigsmark, a Midi-Kezel or other goddess of the Dresden court, the girls were perplexed by the scientific seriousness of the young man's approach and collapsed with giggles at the minuscule scale of his equipment. He left, walking the wet streets alone to his hotel. He got a warmer welcome from the antiquarians. The sale of his Sudetenland farms in 1932 allowed him to spend money freely. The deaths in quick succession of his mother and grandmother allowed him to bid against a Rothschild. Politically, Utz was neutral. There was a timid side to his character that would tolerate any ideology provided it left him in peace. There was a stubborn side that refused to be bullied. He detested violence, yet welcomed the catalysms that flung fresh works of art onto the market. Wars, pogroms, and revolutions, he used to say, are the excellent opportunities for the collector. The stock market crash had been one such opportunity. Kristallnacht was another. In the same week, he hastened to Berlin to buy porcelains in US dollars from Jewish connoisseurs who wished to emigrate. At the end of the war, he would offer a similar service to aristocrats fleeing from the Soviet Union. As a citizen of the Reich, he accepted the annexation of the Sudetenland, albeit without enthusiasm. The occupation of Prague, however, made him realize that Hitler would soon unleash a European war. He also realized, on the principle that invaders invariably came to grief, that Germany would fail to win. Acting on this insight, he succeeded in removing 37 crates of porcelain from the family house in Dresden. These arrived at Tchecoslováquia during the summer of 1939. He did not unpack them.
About a year later, shortly after the Blitzkrieg, he had a visit from his red-headed second cousin, Reinhold, a clever but fundamentally silly character who, as a student, had sworn that Kropotkin's Mutual Aid was the greatest book ever written, who now expounded his views of racial biology with analogies culled from dog breeding. And Utz, he insinuated, even if tainted with alien blood, should at once assume the uniform of the Wehrmacht. At dinner, Utz listened politely while his cousin crowed over the victories in France. But when the man prophesied that Germans would occupy Buckingham Palace before the end of the year, he felt, despite his better judgment, a surge of latent Anglophilia. "I do not believe so," he heard himself saying. "You underestimate this people. I know them. I was in England myself." "Also," the cousin murmured, and with a click of the heels marched out towards his waiting staff car. Utz had indeed been to England to learn English at the age of 16. During an autumn and dismal December, he had boarded at Bexley-on-Sea with his mother's former nanny, Miss Beryl Parkinson, in a house full of cats and cuckoo clocks, which he would gaze at the turgid waves that broke across the pier. He did learn some English, not much. He also made a short trip to London and came away with a vivid notion of how an English gentleman behaved and how he dressed. He returned to Dresden in a racily cut tweed jacket and a pair of handmade brogues. It was this same brown jacket, a little threadbare, a couple of sizes too small, and his leather patches sewn into the elbows, that he would wear throughout the war as an act of faith and defiance whenever German officers were present. He wore it too, his racial purity called into question, during the reign of Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague. One afternoon he confounded his interrogators by pulling from his pocket his father's First War decoration. "How dare they," he shouted, as he slapped the medal onto the table, "how dare they insult the son of a great German soldier?" It was a bold stroke, and it worked. They gave him no further trouble. He lay low at Shevsky Krysov, and for the first time in his life took regular exercise, working with his foresters at the sawmill. On February 16, 1945, news came from that Dresden house was flattened. His love of England vanished forever on hearing the BBC announcer, "There is no China in Dresden today." He gave the jacket to a gypsy who had escaped the camps. A month after the surrender, when Germans and German supporters were being hounded from their homes, or escorted to the frontier in the clothes they stood up in, Utz succeeded in disavowing his German passport and obtaining a Czech nationality. He had a harder time dispelling rumours that he had helped in the activities of Göring's art squad. The rumours were true. He had collaborated. He had given information, a trickle of information as to the whereabouts of certain works of art, information available to anyone who knew how to use an art library. By doing so, he had been able to protect, even to hide, a number of his Jewish friends, among them the celebrated Hebrewist Zechariah Krauss. What, after all, was the value of a Titanian or a Tipolo if one human life could be saved? As for the communists, once he realized that when his government would fall, he began to curry favour with the bosses-to-be. On learning that Clement Gottwald had installed himself in a Prague castle, a work on the throne of the Bohemian kings, Utz's reaction was to give his lands to a farming collective and his own castle for use as an insane asylum. These measures gave him time, sufficient at least to evacuate the porcelains without loss or breakage before they were requisitioned by the Canonieri. His next move was to make a show of taking up Hebrew studies under the guidance of Dr. Klaus. These were the years when pictures of Marx and Lenin used to hang in Israeli kibbutzes. He got a poorly paid job as a cataloguer in the National Library. He installed himself in an inconspicuous flat in Zvetskov Mesto, its previous inhabitant having vanished in the Heiderishiada. Twice a week he went loyally to watch a Soviet film. When his friend, Dr. Orlik, suggested they both flee to the west, Utz pointed to the ranks of Meissen figurines 6 deep on the shelves and said, "I cannot leave them."
Se você gostou dessa leitura, curta esse vídeo e deixe seus comentários abaixo. Eu vou deixar aqui para vocês, na tela final, a playlist com os demais capítulos deste livro. E eu encontro vocês na próxima leitura. Até mais!